Yes, hello. I'm Jason Louv, and this is the 44th episode of the Ultra Culture podcast, where we explore radical new ideas at the intersections of culture, technology, and spirituality with some of the most insightful and unexpected thinkers on the planet, and do our best to tackle the biggest challenges of the 21st century. From the world's newest and most Promethean technologies to its most ancient and profound spiritual traditions, we explore tools for waking up, empowering yourself, and unleashing your own inner spark, because Spaceship Earth needs all the help it can get. My guest today is Spiros Antonopoulos, who's a psychonaut, a yogi, a thelemic magician, and an explorer of truly extreme states. You might have seen him in the documentary DMT, The Spirit Molecule, talking about dimethyltryptamine. He was actually one of Dr. Rick Strassman's initial test subjects in his DMT clinical trials in the 1990s. I met Spiro about 10 years ago in New York. We had a lot of common friends and interests, and I immediately recognized somebody who had truly been way, way out on the fringes of reality and of psychonautic voyaging. I recently discovered that he's just moved to Los Angeles to open a yoga studio in downtown LA. So I had to get him on the podcast to talk about his spiritual experiences and how they've changed and evolved over time. So we had a great conversation ranging all over his spiritual career, starting with his early interest and fascination with magic and esoteric spirituality during the chaos culture days of the 1990s, evolving through his interest in Crowley and thelemic magic, and then DMT, and of course, his then fascination with a very, very serious and profound study of Hindu esotericism, particularly yoga, Vedanta, and tantra, and his evolution into now becoming a very, very serious and sincere yoga teacher. He's been studying yoga since 2001 with his first teacher, Eddie Stern, and then with the Ashtanga yoga master, Sri K. Pattabhi Jois, also starting in 2001 and up till Pattabhi Jois's passing in 2009. He continues to study with Pattabhi Jois's grandson and successor, Paramaguru R. Sharath Jois, and his daughter, Saraswati Jois. And he's now become a yoga teacher in his own right, and he's just opened this studio with his girlfriend, Erica Morton McGill, who's also teaching. The studio is called Los Angeles Yoga Club. It's in downtown LA, and you can find it at losangelesYogaClub.org. They're also having some interesting events there, including an upcoming one with the author Eric Davis in mid-December. It sounds like a fun scene. So Spiro and I had a great conversation that ranged all over the place and really got into the details of, some of the very, very intense spiritual experiences that he's had and what he's made of all of it. And perhaps most fascinating and incredible, we talk about his recent experience having a stroke following an occult ritual that he undertook to contact his holy guardian angel or true self, after which he had a stroke in the frontal part of his brain and lost the use of language and a lot of his memory for several years, and was left to kind of wander the world without a lot of the faculties or filters that so many of us take for granted. I was definitely left speechless by his story, and I know that you're really, really going to be amazed by it. Okay, so you have a great conversation ahead of you. And by the way, I am really happy to announce there is a new feature on this podcast, which the Patreon supporters have been requesting from me. If you've been listening to some of the prior episodes of this show, some of the most recent ones, then you know that when I've been having people over to tape the show, I've also been, cooking some serious food for them and making up some nice meals. And it was requested that I actually record the conversations, kind of do just some obviously not high quality, but just background recording of the kitchen and dinner table conversation while I'm preparing food and then while we're eating. And we're just kind of casually catching up prior to the show. So I'm starting that feature with this episode. I actually recorded about an hour of conversation with Spiro prior to taping the actual show. And we get into some really significant territory there. And I learned a lot. He was really sharing a lot about the different traditions and Vedantic traditions of India that I had, and their history, and that I had no knowledge of whatsoever. We talk about things like Agora and some, spirit contact traditions in Southwest India that I'd never heard of, and their relation to theosophy and how theosophy has kind of really shifted our understanding of what is perhaps more true Hinduism. And it was a really, really fascinating conversation. So I'm basically just setting up a mic in the background and taping those and doing a little bit of cleanup and processing, but not too much, and then uploading it straight to the Patreon. Of course, new interviews are uploaded to Patreon immediately after they're recorded. So now when I'm interviewing people, at least ones who come over in person, both the conversation and then the pre-conversation will be uploaded to Patreon immediately for supporters. So if you're interested in supporting the show and getting access to the extra content, the extra conversations, head over to patreon.com/JasonLouv and become a supporter, and you'll find all of that. You'll also get access to our Discord, which is a very, very thriving and exciting community, and special status on the Discord, along with the satisfaction of knowing that you are helping support this show go strong well into the future. So head over to the Patreon and grab that extra content now. And by the way, don't forget the most sacred and spiritual and mystical holiday of the year is coming up, that day when the veil becomes thin between spirit and matter, and all of your wishes are fulfilled. That day, of course, is Black Friday. That's this Friday and Monday, and there are going to be some great deals on magick.me classes. I'm not going to announce them quite yet because it's not Black Friday yet, and I'm releasing this on Tuesday, but it's just a few days away. So if you want access to those deals, you have to be a member of the mailing list if you're not on it already. So how do you become a member of the mailing list? It's really easy. Go to free.magick.me. That's magick.me. free.magick.me/offer and sign up for the free course at magick.me. You get a free ebook. You get a week of free lessons in magic, including podcasts and videos and articles and guides and of course the ebook and lots more. And of course, you'll be on the mailing list, so you will get an email on Friday announcing the 24-hour Black Friday sale on magick.me. It's only going to be on for one day, and then perhaps a different deal or something related will be offered on Cyber Monday, but you only have that brief window to take advantage of the deal. Of course, you'll also get amazing content as long as you're on the mailing list on a regular basis, including this podcast, announcements when new podcast episodes are up, announcements of new courses and new projects and new books coming up. And it is an incredibly informative, productive, and spam-free place to be. So it's free.magick.me/offer, free.magick.me/offer. It's magic with a K, MAGICK. And make sure you're on the email list and keep an eye out for the Black Friday offer that will be mailed out on Friday. Okay, so looking forward to interacting with you on the Patreon and on the mailing list and in class. And without further ado, please welcome Spiros Antonopoulos. All right, Spiro, thanks for coming over. I'm glad hopefully you enjoyed the Reuben sandwich.
The Reuben was super yummy.
I forgot to toast it. There was that last tiny bit. I really should have toasted it, but It
was still lovely and the conversation was great.
Okay, so tell me about the Sonoran desert frog.
It's a Sonoran desert toad. Yes, toad. The Sonoran desert toad is a toad that secretes 5-methoxy DMT out of some glands in the back of its shoulder, where we would have wings were we to be angels. That is where the toad has glands and can squirt them and dry them and smoke them, and that's a common thing. It's actually too common now, and it's too popular. We should be talking about this on...
Okay. You would think that, of all the things to get popular, it's almost like, the whole thing with psychedelics, it's kind of like we've already strip mauled every single part of the planet. What else can we smoke or inject? It's kind of the same, like gentrification of new. It's like what, regular DMT wasn't enough. Now it's the Sonoran desert toad. But I am curious because a couple different people have actually asked me about it, and I was like, I don't know. I only know one person who's ever done it, and I don't know anything about it. So what's the appeal?
It's 5-methoxy DMT as opposed to NN-DMT, dimethyltryptamine. And the difference is the intensity that even calibrates. It's more intense. It's stronger by a power of 10 in terms of how much to smoke.
So it's not. It's 10. The effect is 10 times as strong, or you just
between 8 and 12 milligrams, as opposed to I don't know what to do with the current DMT that's going around, but it's in 60s, 40s, 80s, 100 milligrams. I don't know. I haven't been in this zone too much lately, but it's stronger in that sense, and it's stronger it lasts 30, 40 minutes as opposed to...
That's a lot of minutes. That's like 4 times the... 10 minutes is enough.
There's a grandeur. It feels grander in some sense, whereas the NN-DMT has a comic booky, or the entities are when those that experience them are there, and you're in a post 3D space. It's a little different. Some people say it's more like white clouds or something. It's a little bit more dreamlike.
Does it have? Yeah, I think NN-DMT for me always seems like I've compared it to a combination of Blade Runner and the rainforest. It's this kind of cyberpunk rainforest experience when I experience it. But so white clouds, is there an ego flattening effect
it's
also?
A little more existential. And there's the ego flattening where the idea of death or life is less relevant than just life is careening on some level, and you're suddenly with it. At least that's what happens for me. But it's not even something I do very regularly, but it is popular these days, and it's funny.
I'm so out of the loop. all the cool kids are shooting up frog toxins. Somebody was telling me about, there's this thing called Kambu. Do you know about this?
Kambu's actually the frog.
It's like poison-free frog or something.
Basically take the skin secretes stuff that you actually put on a reed or something, and then you cauterize your skin, and you peel away what you've cauterized with like an incense stick is the common thing, and then you make 4 or 5 or 10 little cauterized little places, and then you put the goo, and then it's a little bit like a niacin thing, actually.
Like you swell up. Scientologists are really into niacin. Maybe they need to...
So is Linus Pauling. And so is my friend that brought me to the Sonoran Desert.
Interesting. So, but my take on or what I was told is that first of all, it leaves a permanent scarification or semi-permanent. And then, but your whole body swells up.
Phyllomedusa bicolor. It's actually like a poster child of Kermit. Like, really they're very beautiful.
Okay.
Frogs. And
I would feel so bad about disturbing, frogs are so endangered. It's like, I would feel so bad about disturbing their poor bodies.
And if you take as much to that you're swelling, your body's like swelling, in my world, you've done a little too much. You can try other ways to detoxify. Yoga practice helps.
And what is the effect? Like, I was being told that it detoxes you, which is of course a very vague statement, but what are people aiming for with this?
I think mostly people are aiming for extreme experiences that they can tell their friends.
But you do trip, or
you don't really trip. It was used by hunters to stay awake and focus. I think it sort of your visual acuity increases a little bit. Yeah, I think it helps focus, but it's popular now to do it, to the point where you have to purge, which was always a little bit too much when I was doing it.
Okay. So that's not how it's I was reading that people do it and they use it to purge before taking ayahuasca.
Yeah, it's often done. In the 90s when I was doing a lot of ayahuasca, that was the case.
Interesting. Well, it definitely sounded like an extreme story to tell, but I'm a friend to all animal kind. I like them too much. I mean, I guess it doesn't kill them. It's just, I'm sure it's stressful to have somebody remove your back toxins from you, if you're a tree frog.
Yeah, they're very cute.
Yeah. Man, well, I haven't seen you for 10 years. And the when we met was in New York. We met in New York, in 2007 or 2008, right before the economic crash.
Yeah.
And I had just been back from Canada and was working in advertising at that time. And we had a conversation about, I think, left-handed tantra. That's how we started talking. But also, I don't even remember, how do we actually meet? I can't remember.
We might have done it at the poetry science talks.
That's right.
That might have been it. But maybe Eric had gone to one of your parties in Dumbo or outside of Dumbo at one point.
It's all a blur for me, but I think PST sounds about right. I think
that might have been where we connected.
And speaking of DMT, when we first started talking, you told me that you had been part of Rick Strassman's DMT experiments, and you told me what remains to this day the most extreme psychedelic story I have heard, certainly that I've heard anyone in my life tell, and I think I've heard anyone tell in any medium whatsoever. And you had talked about being what I don't want to recap it and do it wrong, but I want to explore this period of your life because it sounds incredibly, like a new frontier for psychonautic voyaging.
This was the 90s, and Dr. Strassman had basically piloted and was executing the first psychedelic research legally in 20 or 30 years. And he was basically looking for relatively sane and healthy individuals. And you had to go through a bunch of tests, including, sanity tests and things like that. And then you did a couple, he shot you up with DMT, basically. You had 4 episodes, 2 which were going to be placebo, and two of them were going to be actual. And then there was also other supplements that they were giving. Mine was cyproheptadine, which seemed to cloud it.
What is that?
I forget exactly. I just remember that it was a bummer, so none of us took it. So it's not really a sane study ultimately.
But he was injecting you with it instead of smoking.
No, cyproheptadine you'd have to take the night before. So
no, the DMT.
Yes, you inject it into your veins, and it was mostly kept in the freezer, so it was cold. They had to warm it up a little bit, but you felt it going through your blood, and then I would start to hear a sound, and the sound would get louder and louder. I'd start to feel burning in my skin, especially around the back of my head. And then it would get to a point where it would feel so consuming, both in sound and in the resonance in my body, that I kind of just had to like surrender, a type of jumping off a cliff or dying. And then I was in this other space, and there were beings there that were testing me. It was very similar to being in a hospital, which I was, where there were people testing me. There was disorderly were running me around, and they actually went through all my subtle body chakras, like X-rays in the X-ray machine, totally tuned them, full perfect.
Was there a sense, were they communicating why they were doing that?
It was all happening too fast, and then by the time you kind of like I felt like I was sort of cognating a little bit more about what's going on. I mean, there's all these like really lovely like ceramic tiles, but they were like glowing. They were like something was earthy about them, but they were also super cartoony. And I was in a 3D-ish space, but it seemed like when you looked up, it was a dome that had many more dimensions. But the second time I did it, there were it was when the cyproheptadine, I did take it, and there was like a synthesizer in front of me, or a big block in front of me, and I felt like this was some reality synthesizer, obviously, and there was stuff going on behind it, and there was beings over there, and I was trying to speak with them, so I would try to like make sounds that I heard and the room heard, but somehow they just ignored me. Like they were onto some other stuff and doing some things that were super important, but didn't have much to do with talking to me about it.
So what were the entities? I mean, it's interesting. The classic description of the DMT experience, other than the machine elves one, is that it's like an alien abduction. And people certainly described it as that a lot in the 90s, probably because, the whole alien abduction thing was in the zeitgeist. There was X-Files and Communion, and it was just something, a touch point that people had. But certainly in my DMT experiences, I've never come to any satisfactory, I don't know if anyone has, I've never come to any satisfactory conclusions about what that is or what those beings are. And I've had multiple experiences with, I guess, what you could call entities, but usually they're observing me. The feeling of testing that you're mentioning is familiar, but for me, they've always been a little bit distanced and kind of observing.
Yep. Yeah.
But what do you maybe I shouldn't even ask as reductive of a question as what is that? But I don't know if you've come to any thoughts or conclusions on it.
No, and I must say that, my super exploratory phase has been 20 years. But at the time, I mean, it's not like I don't tap in now and then, but it's of a different milieu and inquiry. But at the time, it was the beings were beings or characters. We're definitely doing some sort of test. They seem to have some rhythms that were going on that had little to do with the me that I know, but they were a little bit more. They were less. They wouldn't answer any of my questions, but they would be doing performative things, knowing that they were being watched by me. So I would feel like, in some sense, that they were still playing coy to the observer to some way, but a literal English linguistic conversation they were not having.
And did you see them? Like, did they have a form, or was it just a sense that something was there?
I've had different forms. My favorite is a sort of Tonka truck like centaur. So it would be like a centaur, so that it would be a torso of a body, and the back was sort of like a pickup truck, and wheels.
Wow. That's very odd.
But yeah, so that's all part of the imaginal zone of the human experience.
So when you say imaginal zone, that suggests that you think that it is imaginal or imaginary in some way.
I would be more like the mundus imaginalis. So I would say use the term imaginal in a place that has some cognitive reality, very real. In the Platonian sense, where there's like the material world, the actual world of sensory experiences. There's a world of logic and number, and then there's an in-between sphere, just on the other side of this world, that has to do with angels and imagination in the classic sense. And it's equally as real as the physical world.
So I really want to get your opinion on this because, certainly in Western magic, and you mentioned Plato, like everything comes from Plato and Neoplatonism and all of this. That really is the idea. It's like, yes, the imaginal world or the astral world is real. It is shared. It's like a shared internet space in a way. But then you get into the Eastern systems, and with things like the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, and then certainly Buddhism, they say, no, you need to get past that. That's also another level of delusion and illusion. And what is your take on that? Is that a conclusion that you agree with, or has that changed for you?
Well, I wouldn't say they don't have some interchangeable aspects. It has to do with when you're coming to conclusions rather than being exploratory. If you're trying to come to some conclusions, then you kind of collapse a lot of the waveforms, or you sort of say, well, actually, none of this really matters. In the Yoga Sutras, a good bit of the time, you're talking about subtle bodies. You're talking about this exact mundus imaginalis. You're talking about various ways to focus the mind. The whole third chapter, Vibhuti, Ash, is all about magical powers and siddhis, which they say is also you're just going to get lost in. It's not really, in the end, you realize that it's just another space. It's just another place. And the soul is actually yearning, or what in the self on some level is beyond that. But it's not saying, it still spends a lot of time there in the Yoga Sutras. So in the end, there's a type of focus that focuses on focusing. And that's the goal of Patanjali's yoga, as we understand it. And they work together. They're not necessarily, we commonly create a hierarchy of them. And that's the classic sense, is that you graduate from the yamas, what you're looking out at, how you're looking out. You turn that ni yama, turn that back towards yourself, and you then explore how one is taking care of the self. And then you say, okay, the self is taking seat. It's taking a posture. And then when that posture is solid, they say, okay, subtler than this relationship to our body, this body taking a seat, is the breath. And we can still observe the breath. So pranayama. And that is sort of controlled in some sense, but also just observed in a classic sense, because it still has weight. And then we look further and we say pratyahara, which is actually looking at all the sense organs that are looking at the breath and saying, okay, that's all one unit. That's all one thing. We can look at that. We can look at the source of all, rather than looking at the things that we're looking at through those sense organs, we can actually just look at the sense organs. But it's better and simpler to do if we follow the path, the hierarchy of how how we're looking at things, and how we're sitting. So
it's very systematic and
very
step by
systematic,
step.
and eventually in Yoga Sutras, the last three, Dharana, Dhyana, Samadhi, are joined together, samyama, and that's all a type of focus that is then used as a skill, as a visionary praxis towards exploring.
Interesting.
So
interesting. That's a different take. Okay. So, I guess maybe it'd be fruitful to share kind of some of my experience with this, where just having gone through for so many years the psychedelic experience and the magical experience, and traveling here, there, and everywhere, and having all these crazy inner world experiences, I definitely got to a point, even with DMT, where I was like, okay, and ultimately I had, ultimately my take on it was, I'm still Netflix binging, I'm still watching TV. I'm still distracting myself from myself and perhaps what I would like to do with my life in a real sense. I think that seeking for self, like seeking your true self, in many ways is like an addiction. And I likened it in a sense, that there's obviously the phrase chasing the dragon, which is, of course, smoking heroin out of foil, but also the sense of, I related it to the quest for Kundalini awakening, like chasing the serpent, where you're constantly yearning for some true self that's always just 1 inch out of reach. And all the while you're distracting yourself with the magic show and not performing one's function or true will to be, Crowleyan about it.
It's also really easy to get lost in thinking that the experience of the show is the Kundalini itself, which a lot of people have. And so then once you're back in the world, you lose sight of both the experience, the feeling, and you're back to your regular self. And nothing has really changed. So then you want to go back and do that experience again. And you're always just a little further than that first time. So there's something really beautiful about the psychedelic experience. But once we start doing it over and over again, it kind of loses some of its magic.
Yeah. But what you're saying is interesting, which is, you're talking about the 8 limbs of yoga as a platform to go further into psychedelic space. Or, certainly my take on it has been, it's almost for turning that off. It's for, well, not just that, but the constant distractions of the mind. Like we were talking earlier during the dinner conversation about possession, right? And people being possessed by all these external concepts and ideas and thought forms and cultural infections and things like that. And for me, my huge attraction to both yoga and classic Buddhism has been like, I just want to shut that off. I want total focus. I want total clarity. I want total mental presence, and to not have to deal with, in some sense, the astral, which particularly in our world now, I think in the last 5 years, 10 years, particularly, people have gotten totally, the idea of magic and spirituality to become much more popular. And we live in an astralized culture in a way. There's this guy, Charles Upton, who wrote, is a Ghanaian traditionalist. And he wrote, I forget the name of the book, but he wrote this book, I think it's called The System of Antichrist, where he says that we live in a magical world where everyone's obsessed with magic and being something that they're not, and everyone wants to have magic power and be dressed up and be, everyone wants to be the center of attention and have that sorcery. And for him, this is the system of Antichrist. It's like, no, everyone is in his view, like possessed by the astral. He's like, no, like get past the astral, get off it, like get past it.
I mean, that's what the 4th chapter of the Yoga Sutras is actually about, and that's how it concludes. But it's not saying that it's not there and it's not used by there. And it actually, it's the focusing. It's the combination of dharana, dhyana, and realizing that it's all the same samadhi that allows one to explore that. Like you're in a spaceship, basically. There's some sense of like concentration is the spaceship, or at least the fuel for observation. And And it takes you through it step by step and says, actually, at the very end, there's all that, but there's also, there actually could be an end to that, in a sense. And I'm not always 100% sure of that, in the sense of having a conclusion. Because once you seem to have a conclusion, we have a conclusion, we kind of shut down. And that's what happened to me. That's what I really found out about myself when I had my stroke, was that I had ended up in a hospital. And I was, on some level, after having studied the Vedas and the Yoga Sutras and Sanskrit and mantras and pujas and all that, that I had, there was a disdain for the world that I had accrued. And some part of me was like, thankfully, I'm done. I'm done with this world. And I was relieved. And right then I was in a sort of dark space, and it was warm, and I was, just floating. And
this is when you had a stroke.
And I'm in the hospital, and I'm realizing that I actually could be dead. And I was very relieved that I was going to be finally dead. I was done. I've been there, did what I could do, and now I'm done. And I felt like good, thankfully good. And then I started to see little pieces of light, and they flickered like fireflies. And there were more and more would suddenly gathered. And I realized that these are beings of light. These are beings that actually loved and cared and created and shared space. And that actually pulled me back. That was a way of me realizing why I'm here, why I'm on this planet, why I'm sharing time here with you and with other beings that are listening, that it's actually this light shared amongst us all. I don't understand it. I don't know. There's lots of tools. There's lots of ways to understand it. But it's that shared time with beings that I'm here for. So it was really a kind of clarity that I hadn't ever had before that experience. And then when I came back, it was really kind of easy. Like I just share time with beings of light.
So I want to revisit how you got to this experience. So just to go back, because I don't fully know, you had, I guess, already been on the spiritual path and interested in, Indian spirituality and that type of thing. And you had these DMT sessions with Rick Strassman. And I think I might be wrong, but when we were first talking about it, you had maybe mentioned that it was a lot, or you had been under sedation for one period of it, or like you were constantly going under into DMT space.
All right, let me give a quick rundown of my background. In the 90s, I was in Taos, New Mexico. I started to do some practice thelemic magic from a teacher there named Joe Farkas, who was a student of what's his name?
Regardi?
McMurtry.
Oh, McMurtry. Okay.
McMurtry. Yeah.
Yeah.
And we had a lot of his knives and things like that. And so he was on a very middle path perspective. And at the same time, I was starting to do a lot of ayahuasca. I had met some friends that were making it themselves. And I ended up being a sort of guinea pig for a friend of mine who would then put on his shamanic clothes for the famous and the rich. And we would do it days before just to test the waters and the brew. And then he'd kick me out, and then he'd do the full performative aspect of shamanism. He doesn't do any of this anymore.
Okay.
But this was the 90s. And so...
It was the 90s is a great way to start or end any story of this type.
And it was a really beautiful way to be in the world. I also was, in a lot of the zine world then, writing for Boing Boing back when it was a zine.
Oh, cool.
Fringewear Review back when it was a zine.
I remember Fringewear Review. It was so awesome.
Yeah, we did with Eric, we co-edited Chaos Spirituality.
I remember that one.
Yeah, that's the one
that's awesome.
I co-edited with Eric. Anyway, so that's part of what it came, that's where I was. And then I felt so out of my body. And I really wanted to do something. I was working as a coder, and I was doing all these drugs and, magical experiences and practices and, all the book 4 things and lots of writing. It's a lot of sitting, a lot of chanting, a lot of all that stuff. So that's also basic yoga in a sense. And my first, I still return back to Crowley's yoga talks.
Oh yeah, they're so clear and funny.
Yeah. So there's actually one at our yoga school here. Keep a copy. But in essence, that was the beginning, and it wasn't until for some reason, it's always a sort of broken heart that has to lead me. I had to break up with a woman in around 2000 that sort of devastated me, and I was feeling compulsive and out of control. And I decided I had a little drawings of all the primary series in Ashtanga Yoga, and I decided that I was just going to do those every day. And for the time, 2 hours, I couldn't make a break. I couldn't do anything else. I had made my little magical circle, or in this case, yoga mat. And I stayed within it for 2 hours. And that's what I did every day. And it eventually started to have a rhythm of its own and a life of its own. It was like a magic carpet. And eventually I moved to New York. In my eyes, I was moving there to do more experimental DJing and music. But I was also starting to practice yoga every day. And eventually the yoga consumed me, and I had to make a choice between staying up until 2 or 3 in the morning and waking up at 6 and practicing. And Patabi Joyce was in town. The towers fell, and that started to be my life. And at that point, the towers had fallen. Patabi Joyce was in town. And
who is Patabi Joyce for the
Patabi Joyce listening? Is the lineage holder and the person that started Ashtanga Yoga as it's taught. Patabi Joyce has the same teacher as Iyengar and Indra Devi and a bunch of other classic yoga teachers. And Patabi Joyce was in town, and I asked my friend and teacher, Eddie Stern, I was like, who's making the chai for when we all get together? And he said, you make chai? And I said, yes, but that was a big lie, or at least a big backwards in time causality, because at that time I hadn't, but I had a friend that I knew made chai, lived down the street, and we were both from Taos. And so we started to make a chai. I bought 2 big 10-gallon pots and made a big bunch of chai for everybody, and came out. And Eddie was like, do you want to make this every day at the yoga school? And I said, sure. And so eventually I had a little chai shop in New York. And I would just make a pot of chai every morning. I would get to the school at like 4:30, practice yoga, then make tea, and then keep the money to earn a little bit of keep. And that's how I met everyone. That's how I basically practiced yoga. I would practice with Eddie, who was my teacher and friend. And that's how I learned Ashtanga Yoga. And eventually through the various times that Patabi Joyce came, and then I started going to India. At that time, there seemed to be a stricter differentiation between yoga and my past in Taos and doing lots of psychedelics and stuff with Rick Strassman and the 90s in New Mexico. Sorry.
Okay.
So eventually I would just do a few things on the side to stay in the loop of the psychedelic world. But I would mostly be a devoted yoga student and learn Hinduism, learned about, read all the books. The chai shop basically had a bunch of books, and I would just read them as people would come and go drinking chai.
So what were you thinking? I mean, what was going through your mind at this time, and particularly looking back at when you'd had all these DMT experiences and you'd had all these experiences with magic and with Crowley, and what changed when you went more to the Hinduism side? Did you find that it was just more potent? Did you feel it was more healthy? What were you getting from it that was different from where you had been?
Well, the funny thing was that the yoga as we were practicing, it was 99% practice, 1% theory was one of the big things. And so it was really, that appealed to me. It was a way of getting out of my head, which was really strong for me. So by being able to just practice and not really think about it and just feel the fact that I had to set this parameter of a yoga mat and the criteria of showing up to it every day, I'd started to notice things in the world like I'm used to pointing the finger for blame at this being difficult because of this. And then I noticed that the same type of relationship would happen with myself and my body on the yoga mat. And I would be like, actually, it's all me. It's all me. And so wrestling with that and sort of sweating that out, basically, those are the type of toxins that I think come out to some degree when you burn or boil your blood in the classic sense is what they say when you're doing physical yoga practice.
Yeah, that's the core of it, right? I think that for me was the most potent thing, one of the most potent things about both yoga and Buddhism, like Vipassana Buddhism, but even like with Crowley, right? Like asana, right? Mm-hmm. Like stay still, like that's hard. But really then you realize not only how restless your mind is, but exactly what you're saying. As of course Hermeticism, they say as above, so below.
Right.
It's like, no, you're projecting your own experience of your own body out onto the world.
Yep.
And of course, if we want to go into Wilhelm Reich and things like that, people talk about, you store your trauma in your body, you store your memory in your body. And even down to if you're tired, if you're fatigued, if you have some type of chronic pain, you will trick yourself into thinking that that's coming from outside you. Like, oh, that person is the source of my suffering, when really you're just reacting to your own bodily sensations. Yeah, this is one of the very, profound and also, disturbing things that I learned from yoga, where it's like and that's that itself, that right there, for me, I realized that is Maya. That's the construction of Maya. It's like our projections into the world of what we think is out there, when really it's totally self-generated. And it's very disturbing because then, of course, you think of all the people that you've perhaps hurt by projecting your own
very much
stuff onto them.
Yeah, so it takes a long time and it takes a sort of steady rhythm. I mean, I've been more into rhythms lately in general, as basically our breathing is already a rhythm, our days start in similar ways every day. So rhythms are sort of a basic way. It's also what sound is built from. And so those type of rhythms and coordinating them into some sort of synchronization to create a sense of stability. And in a world like today, that's actually kind of a rare bird. And so just to get to a sort of stable, sensible, relatively so, view seems like a really noble and simple clarity that is rare. And so I've gotten off of as much of the grandiose ideas about enlightenment and about samadhi and those type of things. But back in 2001, I was reading the Agora trilogy, totally fascinated with Svoboda and with his whole
that's such a great book,
Castaneda-esque.
Yeah, very. You definitely get the sense of like, okay, like, you know, how much of this is these two guys like seeing what they can pass off to a publisher. But
no, but it's, you know, it's still essentially there's great truth there. And he still, actually, if I ask him a question about Homa, for example, he'll send me a segment of his book, basically, and just say, okay, it's in here. It's right here. So he's still encapsulated actual real things. But he actually also is a way for him to get out of responsibility for the karmas that would involve teaching somebody something.
How do you mean?
He, in his view, and in a view that's common in India, to actually get a real teaching of a practice that's powered, that's empowered, that means that you take responsibility for that person, that you trust them enough, and you spend enough time with that person to know that they can handle it, and that there's a responsibility there to be true to the form, to be true to the energies that are built, that were passed to me. I pass it on in a way that's stable. And he's not going to do that via email.
Yeah. Yeah, that's why I never, I tell people that I'm just passing on information, like as if I was writing like a Wikipedia entry. I'm not doing what you say. But do you think that's the case? Do you think that's actually true?
There's lots of different views. And I think it's true enough in a sense. You have to be like, well, our karma is true. And in a sense, we should be serious about what we're doing. It adds, when you don't have to be sober, but you have to be serious.
Absolutely. And it's a huge thing.
And that means taking responsibility for what you do and what you share. And so I 100% am behind that. But then it becomes more about questioning how we're acting in the world, what we're doing, which is the yoga experience. So all that stuff is really serious. If you actually want to share time with beings and you want to be, you don't have to be like somber, but you have to be really serious about consciousness, about our presence here.
Well, it's a huge responsibility, and it's bigger than people think too, just in terms of, particularly with any of this stuff, you can permanently divert the course of somebody's life. And if they don't know, if you divert them into the deep end and they don't know how to swim, and particularly now, we're at such a precarious moment as a culture, I think, where we're just starting to become cognizant of this side of reality again, in the sense that some people always were artists and psychonauts, but now because of the internet, it's everywhere. And yet it's paired with the kind of dismissive attitude of, oh, it's just all aesthetics, or this kind of postmodern deconstructionist attitude of, oh, it doesn't really matter. And this is perhaps something that chaos magic was guilty of in the 90s, of being completely reductionist about all of it. And that is not, that will only get you so far, and it might not get you where you want to go.
However, I must say that there was a Phil Hine book that I had in the 90s.
Yeah.
Called Condensed Chaos.
Yeah. That's a good one.
And it had a good Ganesh chapter.
Well, he's a good example, right? Because he was like one of the great proponents of chaos magic, and then he just became, basically a Hindu tantric.
Yep.
And that's like his whole thing.
Yeah. So he was a big inspiration to me. And suddenly I started to get Ganeshas in my life, and they sort of pointed me towards, the yoga school I ended up with in New York, the Broome Street Temple on Broome Street in Crosby, was an actual Hindu temple. There were lots of priests. I mean, it's Orthodox.
Yeah, I remember it. I remember it. Yeah.
And I found myself deep in it. At a certain point, I was starting to do, clean up and do the mantras and wear dhotis and I realized that in an essential sense, it's not very different than the Gnostic Mass. I mean, it is, but it's also not.
Different cookies, hopefully.
Different cookies, yeah, for sure.
Always bring your own cookies to the Gnostic Mass. Interesting. Yeah, I haven't talked to Phil for maybe 10 years.
I just was Facebook messaging with him to try to get some of his books, because he just did a whole dialogue about chakras at Treadwells. Yeah. So he has a couple chapbooks coming out.
How's he doing?
History of, I don't know personally how he's doing so much. I don't really know him besides on the Facebook.
I used to, I spent a lot of time with him in London when I was living there, but I kind of had a falling out with that scene. So back in the old Wild West days.
Yeah, the big thing was that basically in the
not
90s,
with him, but with
chaos
other people.
magic, which was liberating in a lot of sense, but it does allow for a sense of responsibility. But also means that everything is, can be sanctified. Everything can be used and understood in a magical sense, and that's liberating.
Yeah, and it's right. I think that's right. Yeah, interesting. So where did you go from here? And I think, so this is probably around the time we met, right? Shortly before 2007, 2008.
2007, 2008, I had been practicing a lot of Ashtanga yoga. I had, my teacher, who was Eddie at the time, and friend, he had told me not to teach yoga, which all my friends were doing, making decent money, and I wasn't allowed, or if I wanted to listen, which is my choice. But in a sense, it actually helped me to internalize some aspects of motive of why you would teach and things like that. So, we met at that time, and I was trying to do whatever else I could. At that point, I had raised a couple $1 million with a guy from Time Warner, who had become a partner of mine for yoga lifestyle brand. We eventually closed up a couple of months later. But it was a sort of last hurrah of like, how can I creatively use the energy and the focus of Ashtanga yoga, of yoga practice, and still do something in the world? And actually our falling out was me blogging about psychedelics. He was like,
He didn't like that?
He didn't like that.
He was too corporate for it?
That was the line in the sand.
Was he personally upset about it, or he just thought that it would scare off investors?
I think he was personally looking for a way out, and that was just easy.
All right.
But still, it's the sort of straight edge. That was the sort of straight edge. That was before Michael Pollan hit the scene.
Yeah, things are a lot different now. Now all those people are on, microdosing LSD.
That's true.
Like, and here I am sitting with instant coffee. I'm so boring. but yeah, interesting. And then,
so when we met, was also around the time that they were making the DMT film. And so I was actually probably just around that time did some of those interviews, which, funny how film sometimes keeps some particular part of your history more known than other parts, just for a weird thing that's just happened to be caught on film.
Right. A transitory experience.
It's
bizarre also how popular, or how much more well-known DMT has become, because I definitely remember that at that time it was, people knew about it kind of, right. But for me, I never would have been exposed to it if I wasn't already in the occult world. It was like a very underground thing. Yeah. And I think Terence McKenna had written about it. That was probably where most people knew it from.
Exactly.
But now, particularly, I think that movie, and then, Joe Rogan talking about it tons. Yeah. Now everybody knows about it. Now it's like, it's just another commonly known substance. But that was not the case at the time. And I remember when I was first exposed to it, it's always an extreme experience, but it also had this vibe of this is a truly occult or very, very hard to access experience while being a human being. Yeah. And that's really changed. Do you have this sense of, I have theorized sometimes that when drug astrals get over visited, they tend to lose a little bit of the vibe. I had an experience, someone I met had an experience on LSD, maybe 10 years ago at Burning Man. And the experience was it just felt like, instead of like that kind of, I don't know, 60s shimmery Sergeant Pepper's vibe, whatever that you would expect from acid. It was like, it just felt like sleazy, like it felt like hanging out with, like a hooker who smells like menthol cigarettes or something like that. It had that like weird, like singles vibe, sleazy attitude. Not literally, that's not what I was seeing. It just had that physical sensation of just like just a strip mall and used space. And it was kind of cool in its own way, but that is when I first started thinking, like, did this space just get, strip mined, basically?
I think there's a lot of truth in that. There's also a lot of truth in just the mystery. If we animate our encounters with the world as being one entity or an entity, will present situations for us to think again about what our expectations are, what our motives are in this. And so we can read it in that existential way, at least, of saying, gosh, I guess, maybe this has been there all along, or maybe I've just worn this out, or my set and setting are a little bit funny for what I'm trying to do. But yeah, we can start to read that there are no accidents and there are no ways of there's no way of knowing, but there are lots of ways of learning. And so we make another choice. You may have chosen not to do as much LSD, or you may have recalibrated the focus in a sense. I mean, it can quickly slide into just a party drug.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that's great about a party drug. You might have old friends that you do psychedelics with, and that's really sweet. But it's also not really going to get at you in a way that the first experience had, which actually just shattered a world that I lived in. And suddenly there's a whole different way of looking at the world. And then we grow accustomed to it. Which is another reason why actual just sitting practices or yoga practices or various other types of forms of focus and controlling the mind become more important.
Recently for me, I've been I don't even want to call it mindfulness, because mindfulness is such a bad word now because it's been so corporatized. So I'm not even going to use that word, but the practice of being hyper focused on your own present experience. So for instance, if you're doing the dishes, being 100% focused on just doing the dishes, not thinking about something else, not wandering, not listening to something, or, thinking about what you have to do in 2 hours, but just, I am doing these dishes with the totality of my being, or I'm driving with the totality of my being, or I'm pumping gas with the totality of my being. And I've been very into that recently. And also just realizing for me, when I'm doing that, it's like realizing, like, no, this is a trip, sit pa Bardo, it's like, this is the Bardo becoming, this is a trip. And in a sense, it can kind of be, I don't want to say controlled, but it can be navigated in the same way that the psychedelic space can be. So we know that, for instance, from the psychedelic space, focus is good. Choice of what you want to experience is good. Being able to let go is really good, particularly in stressful life situations, just like letting it wash over you. Like, okay, this is happening. I'm not going to run away from it. I'm just going to experience it and let it happen. Right. And, if, whatever, if one is I don't mean in a literally life-threatening experience. I just mean, like, if you're going through a tough time and having a lot of stress, that type of thing, just feel it instead of trying to push it away. That for me recently has been, in a sense, it's like, oh yeah, of course. I mean, it sounds so, when you first start learning magic and things like this, people tell you things like this and you're like, okay, like whatever, like show me how to summon the 15-headed god from dimension Xantax or whatever. And you're like, people would say things to me like, oh no, like, just be in your body, focus on your body. I'm like, okay, come on. Like, but now I think I kind of understand that in the sense of, yeah, it's like magic. Okay, magic. the idea of being able to shape one's reality. It's like, well, focus on reality and learn how to navigate it instead of trying to escape it. Like, deal. This is where you're at. Deal. And not in this like
real enough on a fundamental way.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's as real as a psychedelic trip.
Yeah.
And we put so much effort into figuring that out. And in a sense, psychedelics are a training wheel for life, as is ritual, as is yoga.
Yeah, I mean, there's very little difference between not running away from the monsters in your psychedelic experience and turning back and looking at it and being present with it. Maybe not, trying to be its friend, but maybe. But definitely just not running and being calm and looking. Same as if you invoke your 15-headed.
Right. Well, yoga too. I mean, particularly, that was, just Crowley's yoga is one of the best things I've done. I think just the asana, it's like sit still for an hour and do not move, like, and resist, and it's incredibly painful just being and resist the temptation to flinch or scratch or move or adjust. It's like, just feel the pain and there's no escape. I mean, that's what, that's life, right?
That's true.
Until you let go and you relax, and then it doesn't hurt anymore, or doesn't hurt. It hurts in a different way that is bearable.
You definitely get more accustomed to it, and it becomes a practice. But then, still something can happen 20 years later that takes a rug from under you, and you're back in Maya full on. So they're good skills, but it's still, the full experience is still waiting for us. I think on
that's a good point.
Fundamental level. There's lots of roles we can play, as we know in Hollywood. You can be the guru or the actor, or even being just a father or mother in our world, to children. You're still playing a role. And you're playing a sense of enlightened role, or at least someone that makes some sense of this world.
At least you're playing a role,
right?
Yeah, and most people don't, and then they flail around and cause all type of, they're dancing, knocks over tables and glasses and things.
And play out karmas that you inherited from genetically, or at least practically, historically, from your childhood. So yeah, yoga.
But you had this. So this was right before you had a stroke, or was there a bit of an in between?
I had the stroke maybe a couple of years after we had our lunch.
Okay.
At an Indian restaurant in 27th Street or something, Lexington. And what was going on then was that I was breaking up with my wife, which was a catalyst, as well as doing a invocation of my holy guardian angel, sort of an abridged Abramelin ritual.
Can you, for people who don't know what that is, can you say a little bit about that?
It's been a little while, but I mean, from my memory, what it is a way to invoke a noble sense of the self. We can externalize it, and it may actually be pragmatically an angel that guards over us, but it's at its simplest, it's a noble idea of ourself, or you could call it our true self, or and until you actually have a dialogue with that, until you have some sense of negotiating with that, we really have we have no rudders in our world. We have no way to gauge what's true, like Foucault's subjectivity and truth. Basically, those are what you're sort of invoking. I may have had more grandiose ideas about what my holy guardian angel would do, but I had no idea that it would involve blood in my brain and a frontal lobe. But I was doing that, and at the same time, I had met a sort of enlightenment teacher of sorts in Santa Fe, spending more time with him. He mostly, he was the only guru guy that would talk about sex and money.
Okay.
And have you watch lots of movies, like really B-grade Korean horror films, and talk about them from Vedantic terms. And I decided that I would write for an hour a day to watch the mind. So it was a sort of spy versus spy view on how to actually understand who I am, or what is going with the mind constantly reeling. It was just another tactic for, okay, so I could sit there for an hour, but still the mind is very squirrely. You know, you can zoom out a little bit and say, okay, I'm going to let you still reel with thoughts, but I'm going to look the looking is something else. And I'm going to focus on the looking rather than, jamming up to a perfect quietness or whiteness. I'm just going to zoom out and see the vastness of a space of which I'm just a little freckle. And so I would write. And what I didn't know, and 2 weeks later, I would be doing a yoga pose. I would be doing my Sunday yoga practice, and I did Mayurasana, and got a bad headache. And you would usually practice through that and continue, and it would sort of work itself out. But this was really bad, so I lied down and fell asleep. And somehow crawled to my bed, but I basically woke up and it was the next day. And I wasn't sure what was going on. I still had a really bad headache. I thought I just had a really bad cold. I drove to the co-op in Santa Fe, got some food, drove back, cooked it, fell asleep, and it was the next day. And then it was the next day again. And after about the third day, of just flashes of wakefulness. Otherwise, it was a lot of sleep. I started texting people and realized that I couldn't really text. I had autocomplete. So I send just nonsense, weird stuff to all my friends. And they started talking, and eventually someone came to my house and took me to the hospital. And they didn't figure out for a long time that I actually had a hemorrhage going on in my frontal lobe. And they basically decided to not do surgery because it wasn't getting any worse. They got me ready. They found out that it was actually a frontal lobe that was affected. They called a doctor, a neuroanatomist. The doctor came. They got me ready for surgery. The doctor looked at it again, did another scan, test, and he said it wasn't getting any worse. So actually, I think the sleeping for 3 days was the best way for my body to achieve a sort of homeostasis.
Wow, that's crazy. Wait, what's the thing they tell you never to go to sleep on, right? It's a concussion, right? If you go to sleep, that's it. Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So this was, it's probably the best thing I could have done, was to just conked out. Because by the time I got there, and I was in Santa Fe, I wasn't in New York or LA, where the doctors and neuroscientists, the neuroanatomists would have been afraid that it was a stroke that would have recurred. And they would have been at fault if they didn't go in and fix what was going on. This doctor was like, well, let's just see what's happening, and we'll keep you here for a couple of days. But all this is sort of cognited outside of my, rebuilding history from the experience of it. Basically, at that time, I also was going through something where I was at least playing in my head like I was dead, and super psyched about it, partially because I didn't have to experience all the things in the world that debts I owed or blah, blah, blah. So basically, as I'm becoming aware of what's going on in the hospital, I realized that my brain is being filled with blood, and that actually my brain could collapse. Flood and collapse. And I was sort of rooting for it on some fundamental level, partially because of I mean, I don't know at the time. The thing is the thing that struck me the most was that I had a sort of wiping my hands feeling. And that was sort of a thing that I would read in a lot of Buddhist texts, but more in, a lot of the yoga texts and the Vedic texts, the Vedanta, all had a sort of disdain ultimately for the world. You had a way of just being done with it. And I think that that fueled a lot of what had driven me up to that point, is a similar disdain. And that led me to being in a really dark, vast space. And it was warm, it was comforting, and I was pretty happy with being dead, and finally completed my task of being a person in the world. And then faintly there'd be a little, like a little star in the sky, or a little light, and then another little light. And pretty soon it felt like fireflies, little beings of light that would cluster around. And I realized that each of those beings of light were beings that had loved, beings that had cared for me, focused at me or with me. And these were beings that I had shared time with. And suddenly it became really important that I be in the world, that I am here in the world, and I've come back to the world just to do that. And that may have been why I've always been here, is to share light with beings, share time in space with beings. And so it became very crystal clear what attracted me to this world and why I'm here. I wasn't as concerned with completing my task or having another goal besides shared time with beings and beings of light, that little spark within us all, within all beings, that somehow to nurture that, to share things, to feed it in a way that helps individual beings or group beings, beings of light, just foster and live together. And so that became really clear. And so suddenly I came back into the world and eventually went home. And I couldn't actually speak in a coherent sense. I would still write in my journal. But the first day back, it was just gibberish. I wrote for an hour of gibberish. Then the next day I could do like 2-letter words, maybe 3, but I'd already forget what I was writing about 3 words back. But I wrote for an hour. And so I eventually realized I couldn't afford my apartment in Santa Fe, and I went to my teacher and friend's place outside of Santa Fe, who is talking about enlightenment all the time, from morning to night. And we watched lots of crazy movies. We watched all 116 episodes of Lost together. Okay. He's like, let's start that, and by the time we're done, you'll be cured.
Okay.
So, but we talk about weird physics and the Vedas, but mostly with the idea of the broken heart as a sort of gateway towards understanding. One of his big riffs was about the broken heart being actually the true heart, that the sensitive heart is the broken heart, and the idealized heart is one that's actually imperfect because it's shielded. It's shielded from the sensitivity to being in the world. Yes, it hurts. Yes, you feel things. That's part of it. That's being in the world. So the brokenness gives you an aptitude for something that's essential to the human experience. And I stayed there, and eventually I got in a car and I drove around to all my old family and friends and visited a lot of people from my history. And it was nice to see people. But I also felt a little bit like a stranger in a strange land. I felt like I was wearing a coat that everyone recognized. That coat was my body. And suddenly people would be like, "That's a really nice coat," and I would be like, "Well, that's cool, but let's get down about now. Let's actually share light because we're here." And a lot of people were really busy. They have other lives going on, there are things going on, and
did you just? I'm curious. After having that realization and feeling totally opened up by it and vulnerable, when people were still shielded, when you were trying to share that with people and they were shielded, what was your response? How did you take it?
I think, it was a little bit awkward because some of it was also I was still also technically sick. I was technically just also had a stroke. So there was some sort of sympathy thing that was also going on, and also just gratitude that I was okay. And so in the end, I felt like, I had gone and visited those people. I care about those people, and they have their lives. You don't have to talk about enlightenment or being. You don't really have to really go down that or resonate with that. It's there. And so I was just like, well, I'm kind of on my way. Then I would just go to the next person in my life, family member, but also deal with old karmas that I had if I could.
Did you feel it coming up in a new way, or old stories resolving in some way?
In some way, particularly with my father. But a lot of my family didn't really also come visit me in my stroke experience, stuff like that. Basically, my family was friends of mine from San Francisco that flew in to see me. But essentially, it sort of also was a way of loving, but also letting go of some karmic connection with the family. It was a way of being there, and I still check in and stuff like that. There's no hard feelings or anything, but it didn't feel like as engaged with them as beings in the sadhana of being. The other thing that was going on this whole time with my writing was that I still was, I had to go to speech therapy a couple times a week. I still, in groups that were super intensely driven, I would get headaches. I had to basically just learn how to remember names of actors, just dumb or anything, the names of streets that I would drive down. They were blocked off for me for a long time. And I would take long walks on the mesas in Santa Fe, and I would just try to remember. We'd be watching a lot of movies, so I try to remember, okay, let's name some directors that we just watched, and I wouldn't be able to do it. And once in a while, I'd find the case where my mouth would say something like, actually, now I can't even think of a director, but I'd say Spike Lee, and I would be still searching in my brain, but my lips would say Spike Lee, and I have to listen to my lips.
Okay.
And say, oh, Spike Lee, yeah, that works. That's one. And so it was definitely a way of recalibrating various parts of memory, both gestural and muscle memory, but also ways of engaging with others. So I really couldn't. People would ask me questions and we'd talk, and sometimes we had to do a 20 questions type thing to get to me to one name of a street that I was talking about. But largely it was a way for me to see that I was driven by my labeling. So labeling and categorical thinking, which is rampant in how Google and Facebook make money.
Yes.
And how we're labeled and culturally. But I mean, it's also essentially how the brain worked to categorize and to be clever and to do all those things.
That's so fascinating. I mean, in a sense, I mean, that's another big core of the magical experience, getting out of the linguistic brain, even going back to the story of the Garden of Eden, where Adam is naming things and thereby limiting them. And as long as you can name and label stuff, you're not in reality. You're in a construction. There's, of course, the famous William Burroughs line of language is a virus from outer space, and, having to cut up language to get free of it. And to have that experience so, viscerally wouldn't even do it justice, right? That's intense.
Yeah, to me, I kept coming up with the cask of Amontillado, where people would use these bricks to stand on a pedestal to talk, more and to speak broadly, but eventually those bricks would eventually keep climbing up and eventually be our own grave. So that was how I thought about it at the time. But yeah, it was a wonderful, and it was in a sense what I was asking for at the beginning of my invocation.
So do you think that this was a successful operation in a sense? It's like you did the Abramelin operation and this was the magical result?
Yes, in a sense, totally. It taught a lot about who the noble self is, what the parameters, what drives, what motives. The operation was, I never knew at the time, I couldn't really tell. And there was a lot going on. I was staying at a weird house in Santa Fe where there's 6 or 8 people, and 6 or 8 people visiting that are here to get some teachings, and there's vegetarian food every day, wine every night. There's gardens, it's lots of fresh vegetables and horses and dogs and little stores in Santa Fe that are owned and operated by the crew. So it's like a whole operation, and Danny was just there to contemplate. And I think he kind of actually disliked having me around to talk about things. So his big thing was about enlightenment, maybe as simple as shining light on things, including the self. But using that as a exploratory method for being present. So I had that going on at the same time, but I also had the sort of construct of being the enlightened guy and being the student and what that looks like. And so every day I would write in my journal, the pros and cons of that. I'd be angry about it or upset or, all sorts of things. But I wrote in that journal for, over a year. So I kept really rigorous notes, field work of the anthropology of myself as it decompressed and recompiled, and, I could see not just how the thinking, it's a sort of naive thinking. I was like a child in a sense of the mind didn't have a construct of experience. I mostly just felt things. And so, but I also didn't lose wit to a certain sense. I was just a little slower perhaps. So in a sense of whether the operation was successful, I would still say that it was, in the sense that I was asking to see beyond the seer, beyond my identity with the seeing. And I was shown that by flushing the whole frontal lobe out, the left frontal lobe, and really just experiencing the world as it is. The two people, Jill Bolte Taylor, her stroke of genius, and Ram Dass were my big inspirations during that time. And it was Jill Bolte Taylor was she was a neuroanatomist. I was I'm a yogi. I was a yogi. And I got to watch the brain fall apart with the yogic perception.
And so what was your take on what was happening from the yogic angle. And I'm also curious that having gone through that and having your experience of yoga, you know, how did that change your view of consciousness, and not just consciousness, but the sense of consciousness being rooted in the brain? You know, if you could have that experience looking at it from the angle of yoga, but also from the angle of, you know, its consciousness is from the brain, and the brain, there's trauma happening in the brain. What did you learn going through that, and did it change your views on either one of those things?
Well, it changed my view on what's driving the Spiro bus, what's driving the experience of the world. And what was seen before was structures and labels, which can be very beautiful and they can make coherent sense, but that the actual world is a little soupier and goopier, that those structures can help make sense of things and can work with the soupy and goopy, but that there's something essentially about simple things like truth, and even our idea of subjectivity, especially when rooted in language like I and us and them, and all those things help structure something that can be, you know, you and I can also, I mean, we know this from the Burroughs Geisen and from Suarez Third Mind stuff, that, you know, there's actually much more going on between a presence of several beings in a room. And suddenly, when that's just normal experience, it took a long time for both me to become refamiliarized with the history of myself and what I was and what people were expecting me to be. And I was a little bit, it was a really beautiful sheen on the world. There was a certain confidence in the world that it also brought. A confidence that things were going to actually be okay, that I didn't know what was going to happen, but that things sort of happened of their own accord and they were sweet. Sometimes there was rough stuff, but that sort of soft confidence may have been sometimes too soft for the world that we currently live in. But amongst friends that I eventually would network with and cruise around with, it was okay. I slept on a lot of couches across the country and things like that. So the difference between, I mean, the yogic sense of mind, I mean, and India and Sankhya is all about, you know, classifying the various aspects of consciousness down to the elements of matter. And in a sense, what I really had a sort of rudder on, or softening, which was the ahamkara, or the labeler of I, that was definitely quieted to the point where I could still see me, but I was sort of like that little guy, like I said, and then a little hair on the ass of God, you know, in a big, vast sea of sunsets and things like that. So it wasn't that it finally made sense, or like the yogic structures, or that I finally saw what they were exactly pointing at. But I loosened my grip on what it all meant and what it was all used for. And I realized that a loose grip was good enough, that actual truth is relative. You know, the truth is a living situation. And so it's never going to look exactly like the structures that we build.
Yeah. What about now? How long has it been since your stroke?
It was late 2010.
So 8 years or so.
8 years or so.
And how's your realization from that time, or the realization that you gained at that time, has that changed? Has it become more integrated with day-to-day life, or have your views changed again, maybe, and evolved from that?
Well, I mean, part of now is just trying to be a little bit of a normal, quote unquote, normal person, an embodied person, a present person, and also to, in my own path, I struggled for a little more stability in my life. So, I now teach yoga and as my daily practice, and I hadn't done that for a while until after my stroke, when actually Eddie would fly me in to teach yoga at his school to try to also give me some groundedness. And so in a sense, the integration of teachings that it had sometimes are get lost in the day-to-day shuttle of finding, driving to the school, teaching people the day-to-day businesses, struggles with people, or or just the joy of working. But it's sometimes, I also just did a lot of reading, and watching movies was sort of what I considered my work at the time. And now I barely have any time for that. The contemplative aspect that it opens up is actually one of the parts I missed. And also just the soft sheen of that phase of life actually fades. And then it becomes a memory in a sense. And so
everything is impermanent.
It's even
enlightenment.
Yeah, I mean that's what the Yoga Sutras and other people say, that there is a sort of stable, eternal aspect to consciousness that is ever present, and I can buy that. But it's not something that holds steady in this mind. It ebbs and flows more like the ocean.
I'm curious. So as a teacher now, you're teaching yoga. How do you, from having all these experiences, do you work to impart some of this to your students, maybe in a subtle way, or does it inform how you're teaching yoga and how you approach the whole thing? I know for me, in teaching magic and meditation and just very basic stuff online and some advanced stuff, I try to, it's of course informed by 20 years of, life experiences that I could never summarize. And, it's like I could sit here and write, a 10-volume autobiography or something, but it's like, there's so much there. How can I impart that? It's almost impossible in a sense to, like, even the experience that you're talking about, you can explain it, but with all these things, people have to go through, not specifically what you went through, but magic it changes you in irreversible ways, or spirituality or yoga or whatever, whatever language you want to put on it. But again, to follow you, not labeling it too much. But, when I'm teaching people, I try very hard to just give them the technique so they can have their own experience. And then I tell them what not to do because it's dangerous. But outside of that, I try not to, pregame them in a way, or, give them some meaning or some narrative or some mythology around it, or tell them what they're supposed to experience as if there's a right way to do it. And just, I have to trust, and I have to have the faith that, the universe provides people the experiences that they need when they are ready to have them. And I think that's pretty infallible. It's like there's no escape from it in a sense. So, but I'm curious, like, how do you, having been through, some extreme psychonautic voyages and life experiences and, very, heavy things, how does this inform your teaching? Or does it? I don't know.
I think it's basically embodied in some of the teachings. The way I teach, the Ashtanga yoga that I was drawn to and which I practice and teach is all about gestural rhythms and body stuff. That's more about not doing things in the mind, and how to like just let the body do the body thing. And in a sense, that can be shared with in ways of relating to our breath and our bodies, in a sense, loosening our grip. That we use that everywhere. Ways of talking about the subtle body and the Mula Bandha and Uddiyana Bandha, is the various parts of the yogic lexicon and scriptures can talk about that. And it can be really useful. But I mean, the real thing is really helping people to get outside of the Instagram ideas of what the yoga poses are, what they should be doing, and just give them a simple set of rhythms for them to have their own experience and to hopefully stabilize that. I mean, one of the readings of the Yoga Sutras just says the yogas chitta vritti narodaha, instead of the thinning or the focusing of the mind, it's also just the stabilizing of the ripples of consciousness. It can still be rippling. It's just to have a stable view. And I think that's really an important aspect to share, and it's one that had been going on the whole time through those experiences, and it's one that helped me personally to, if not make sense of, it gave a substrate, sort of mycelial aspect for which other things could fruit. And so that's the idea of sharing it. I mean, there's sometimes aspects of the personal experience that may be useful to people, and that's why we also do other events at our space, is to sort of counterpose, because the Ashtanga world is also very traditional and rigid in its structures. And there's something beautiful about the rigidity, and I can teach that, and I'm a part of it. And there's, but there's also a whole bunch of issues that there's critical issues of any sort of cult, any sort of group of people, corporate or, guru or yoga. It's all, has to do with lots of people, lots of intrigue, lots of aspects, but the basic essential qualities of teaching somebody how to, focus. Where do you focus when you are doing this? What is your breath doing? How am I holding myself? How does breath happen with movement? Those are simple things. And so I think essentially what I learned was that keep with the real simple things, and let people, as you were saying, let people have their experience. And all that you can do is do something simple like that. And some people will actually find some seat in there and some inspiration, and will nurture that little light. And some people aren't ready or have a different path. Yeah. And so there's a little bit of that.
I think that's all you can really do. Well, I don't know, but I mean, I think that's kind of really all you can do as a teacher, is kind of make a little nursery and nurture people through their own process of unfolding, and keep the wolves from the door in the meantime.
Yeah.
And keep them safe while they're in that process. Because it is a very, it's a very critical transitional period in the growth of any adult human life cycle, so, and particularly in our culture where people they still halfway or more than halfway believe it's not actually real, and it's just like a fashion accessory or something like that. So it's tricky. It's interesting you've moved to LA to do this also, because, I like when I moved here, the way I was thinking about it, it's like, this is the burning grounds. The burning grounds is not, you can meditate in the cemetery. That would be way easier than trying to, even with wild dogs and bandits, much easier than trying to maintain spiritual presence in the most ego-driven city on earth.
It's true. It's been actually quite a chore. And it's always been in my head of doing it. So it's not without its multitude of challenges. And that's also why we have a sort of ironic little cave in the middle of downtown, is like in the middle of Gotham. There's a little cave,
the Bat Cave,
and you can go there if you can, deal with the traffic, and whether there are 10,000 other reasons why you wouldn't go, or you'd go to your local, very beautiful yoga place in your corner, and seek out a different way of interacting with yoga and actually learning self-practice, which is mostly what we practice and mostly what we teach. So it's learning how to learn about yourself through rhythms and practice and gestures. So Los Angeles has been, on one level, I thought a lot of people were really in Los Angeles more experimental. There's pockets of people that were experimenting and are experimenting with sexuality, with finance, with spirituality, cults, and so those type of things. And so while that's kind of true, you still have to deal with yourself. And if yourself isn't fully clean, or at least clean enough, then it just gets messier and messier.
Yeah, that's true. Los Angeles, this is changing now, but the way that Los Angeles has always traditionally been a very forgiving city in some senses, in the sense that it was relatively much cheaper to live here than New York or San Francisco. And when you're living, New York, it's also extremely hard to maintain spiritual practice just because everything is so frantic and frenetic, and people are more like quote unquote real in New York for whatever that's worth. But also, I always likened New York to being like in a school of swimming sharks, where you're in this giant school of predatory fish looking for the next meal. And sharks, of course, have to constantly keep swimming because they breathe through their gills. They don't have lungs. And so if they stop swimming, they start to sink and the other sharks eat them. That's kind of New York. So, New York is a very, very much, rewards, predatory, capitalistic, very frosty behavior, jagged, sharp mentality.
Although when I was there, I mostly worked as a chaiwala. I woke up at like 3:30 in the morning, which means I went to bed at like 7 or 8, and I'd wake up at, I think, 2:30 and ride my bicycle at 3:30 when it was still last night for everyone else.
You were in a different dimension.
I went to a temple. And
that's a different dimension. So that doesn't, that's something else entirely.
So I guess it's already been built into my system that I was going to go against the grains
there
a
you
bit.
Go.
And find, to me, New York was about intensity.
No, totally. And I love it. I love that intensity. But LA is a little different in that it has been a forgiving city, just in the sense that it's understood that people come here to do crazy things and not like take a crazy business risk, but to like be a comedian or an actor or a singer. And because of the pace that the entertainment industry sets, it's, people who are in the entertainment industry more or less spend almost all of the year waiting for going to auditions and waiting for a call. And people are very, very slow here. And actually most of the entertainment, they have this weird structure in LA where people who are in the entertainment industry get to claim unemployment for basically forever because of how the tax code is written if you're in that industry. So that's kind of sets the tone here, which is very slow in a sense, and nobody's really, it's okay to be bohemian here. Nobody's expected to be a Wall Street broker. That's changing though, because the rent is going up considerably in the last few years. But there's also, I don't know, I've always had this sense that there's two LAs, right? There's like the entertainment world LA, like the stereotype LA. But there's also this side of LA that is very spiritual. It's like Yogananda called it the Varanasi of America, where, everybody's interested in some type of spirituality here. And I think it's because, people want to be the center of attention. I think that's why Scientology has been so successful here, because Scientology is all about you and your complexes and being audited and all that. But in a sense, though, there's also a real danger to LA where people just kind of become vaporous. Like they kind of drift off into the vapors for years on end, and they think they're getting somewhere, but they're in this kind of desert mirage state. And it's very easy to become ungrounded here. I mean, just look at all the stories of celebrities becoming, totally off in the clouds. It's a very strange city in that way, where it's very comfortable in many ways. The weather is always nice, but people kind of drift off into the vapors of their own imagination with every passing year. So
it's true. It's a different relationship to the imagination and the imaginal zones and mundus imaginalis, and it's easy to get lost in a lot of those things. But all the more reason why embodied practices could be useful. But it also takes takes effort and rhythms that take a commitment. And so the way that we teach is a little bit not unpopular, but isn't as flashy as some. But it's still that part is actually totally fine in the Ashtanga world and in Los Angeles. It just takes I think it just takes a little bit of steady rhythm, just like when you're doing a ritual or when you're practicing yoga, like staying steady, not being fully reactive to, dealing with things when they arise, but not being reactive, and staying steady, not worrying about various pragmatic things beyond their necessities. It's a good practice for keeping a steady mind in the wisps of Los Angeles, the fogs.
Yes, very important.
And fires.
Yeah, right. Yeah, knock on wood. So tell, what is your studio called, and where can people find out more about it, and how would one get involved if they wanted to check that out?
It's called the Los Angeles Yoga Club, and losangelesYogaClub.org. You can look online. It's downtown in the Fashion District on Maple, and a building called the Bendix Building, which you can see. It has a big sign, it's red sign you can see from miles away. And the best way to do it is to stop by or text or email. The only thing that's really needed is a commitment. There's costs involved, and things like that, all of which, for someone that's pure of heart and intent and commitment, all that stuff can be worked out. But the main thing is a dedication to the practice. And if you're interested, come by. We're also opening a apothecary, a Western herb and potion and elixir space, more potions and spritzers, a lot of Onerigen work. And we're also doing a visionary praxis seminar with Eric Davis and Jennifer Dumper and Erica Morton McGill, my partner, about basically ways of navigating focus and energy in the world, or in the imaginal world, or in ultimately in the focus of, in the non-dual sense of an eternal consciousness awareness that's ever present. But in any of those cases, we have various practices and herbs and routines and breathing aspects. So those type of things are also available. Ardor.la, ARDOR, which is a book by Roberto Calasso, where he talks about Vedic culture, which leaves no trace besides rapture. Very interesting, cool book. But it's also, ardor also means tapas. So it's a way of having heat and transformation.
Nice. So Los Angeles Yoga Club, downtown LA, and the workshop with Eric Davis is in December, is that right?
December 15th. It's the Visionary Praxis. It's on Eventbrite. Also on Arders and Los Angeles Yoga Club's Facebook.
Sweet. So losangelesyogaclub.com, you said, or .org? You said?
.org.
.org. Okay.
Also works.
All right. Well, that was an awesome conversation. Thank you, Spiro, for coming over and
Thank you, Jason.
sharing a lifetime of experience.
Very lovely and yummy sandwich.
Nice.
And lovely conversation. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Okay, hope you really, really enjoyed that show. I definitely had a great time talking with Spiro. Remember, the Black Friday sale is coming. If you want to have the one-time 24-hour offer, it is going to be sent out, and you need to be on the mailing list. So go to free.magick.me, free.magick.me/offer, and sign up for the free ebook and email course there. And you'll also be on the mailing list, and we'll get access to that exclusive 24-hour only offer for Black Friday. All right, don't forget to become a Patreon subscriber if you want access to interviews before they're released, and also the exclusive dinner conversations, which will not be released anywhere else except for Patreon subscribers, and access to the Discord and special status on the Discord, and the joy of hearing this podcast long into the future. Okay, I will see you next time, and until then, lots of love, I honor you, and stay awake.